Okay. So first of all, I appreciate people coming out or tuning in or whatever they're doing during this time. And I also appreciate, the church committee and the rector asking me to do this. And I also just want to say how much we appreciate this church. Suzanne will tell you, for those of you who don't know Suzanne, she's in the back with Wally's dog. Suzanne will tell you I am not an easy sell when it comes to churches, but I'm a pretty easy sell here because this is just a great congregation. So thank you very much for that. I was asked to talk about my spiritual journey, and since there's nothing particularly earth-shattering about that, in case you find anything that's curious or interesting, I'd urge you just to kind of pop up and ask a question or make a comment or do whatever it is you want to do. Plus, it'll make me think that you're paying attention and interested, so it's kind of a win-win for all of us. My favorite rock and roll magazine is a magazine called Uncut, and every month in Uncut, they have they feature somebody new, and they put a little pin that says "I'm new here." And in my view, they kind of overrate the new rock and roll musicians. But I want you to remember the charity of the editors of Uncut because I'm new here. So, and I am new here, but I'm not new to Wyoming. And though I'm not particularly pleased about the COVID reason for the delay, particularly with my hair being what it is, I was kind of pleased that it was delayed till this week because there were two things that happened this week that changed this a bit. The first was, if you were here last Sunday, the reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, not just the message about justification, but also the emphasis on hope, which I think is one of the most underappreciated of the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. The second thing that happened is my old pal John Haynes, whom I've known since Miss Irene's morning kindergarten at Vital School, sent me the stirring preface to his new book, Never Leaving Laramie, which is coming out in September. And by the way, it is $19.95 on pre-order. I told him I would mention that. It resonates with this talk, which could be called Never Leaving Wyoming, despite having actually left. Whatever spiritual expedition I've had has been tied in with various vocational and geographical travels. And against my deepest inclinations, I've been a bit of a peripatetic. And I've also put my chips in the pot a few times, which was also true of my mom and dad at least once. Both grew up in the outer boroughs of New York City, and neither had been west of the Mississippi River when in 1957, the Wyoming State Department of Mental Health offered my dad a job as a clinical psychologist, which he accepted. They packed up their things and moved from Pennsylvania to Cheyenne, where a couple of years later, their second son was born. And then 2 years after that, he was offered a position at the university in the psychology department, which he accepted. And so I grew up in Laramie. And I grew up in an avidly secular household. The opinion of religion in my household was on a pretty short continuum between indifferent and dismissive. My dad was a clinical psychologist. He was a first-generation college student, and for him, Freud's Future of an Illusion pretty much summed up what needed to be said about religion, although my stepmother eventually softened up old Pops on this a little bit. My mother, who grew up Catholic, had basically the same attitude and never did soften her opinion. And this was all before the children of Lake Wobegon were all above average, and when trophies were given only for winning. My mom and dad, I have to say, were a little bit ahead of their time. They were complimentary when my brother and I did well. They were encouraging when we failed, so long as we tried. Education mattered in our home, and we both got excellent grades, except for me in geometry, but we won't talk about that. And our parents always made sure that we knew that they thought we were pretty smart fellows. They also thought and told us that we were honest and relatively kind, except for things that they didn't know about. And I suppose by and large we were all right. But And I want God to cover moms and dads' ears at this point, because if they hear this, they're going to think they did something wrong, which they didn't. But I never really believed any of it. I mean, sure, on the level on which they meant it, I thought I was, reasonably smart. I thought that, teachers who were giving the grades were probably right about what they said. People who were judging good and bad behavior were probably basically right. But for as long as I can remember, I felt, actually I knew, because I always knew better than everybody else. I knew that there was a deep, deep rot kicking around inside me. I knew it. I never did my best. I never was just a nice kid. I always struggled to be a gracious winner and loser, and at least inwardly generally failed. There was always, always, always something I could have done better. So, those who say they live their life with no regrets, I have a little bit of envy for them, because they're either better than I am, they are deluded, or they mean something different than I do. Because for me, if I think about it carefully, which, by the way, I try not to do very often, there really isn't a day that goes by where I don't have at least one regret. When I was in my 20s, working on my PhD in theology, my dad said to me, "I didn't understand why you became religious. I still don't, but it didn't surprise me, because there was always something just a little bit different about it." He meant that kindly. You can mean it however you want. Other than the Denver Broncos, my life is largely controlled by rock country and West African music, so I'd put it this way. However much we appreciated the melodies of each other's lives, and we did, my dad and I were always playing a different bass line. But the melodies were similar. Although we kids had basically been raised to leave home, and my brother Mark escaped to Washington, D.C. pretty much as soon as he was able, when my turn came, I wasn't ready to leave. I wanted to stay in Wyoming just a little bit longer. Although I would leave midway through college, it wasn't because I was unhappy or dissatisfied. It was simply because there were gaps that I was trying to fill. It was supplement and not opposition. It was added texture and not replacement. There's always been kind of a hole, and as the recently deceased singer Leonard Cohen once sang, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Every choice includes a destiny, or providence, if you will, of things that we didn't choose. For quite material reasons, I transferred to a small Lutheran college in Western Illinois, where two fates intervened. First, 20 or so years after graduation, I introduced myself to Suzanne, who attended the same college at the same time, even though we didn't know each other then. Also, two of my closest friends that are now 40-year friends are, our old college friends. Second, the college required that I take religion courses, so I determined to get those out of the way so that as quick as I could, so that I could get on with real education. To my surprise, I couldn't get enough. This was chewy stuff. It was not shut up and believe, but considered and really careful thinking. I had the good fortune to have my first theology class with a man who took no guff and was not particularly sympathetic to unreflectiveness, no matter the pious-sounding terms that most of the students there could put to it. I read books I didn't understand, and I tried to muddle through, but it was his class discussions that unsettled students the most, and an early one in particular stuck. The class was united. It was a small class, but 10 people were united, and then there was me, who just kept my mouth shut. But they were united in talking about the importance of moral purity and becoming more moral by acting more moral. The professor stopped everybody after about 10 minutes and said, but telling a lie does not make you a liar. You tell the lie because you're already a liar. Light bulb goes off over Kyle's head. no one notices because Kyle is keeping his head low and his mouth shut. What Peter Beckman said isn't, I don't think, 100% right, as most pithy brilliance isn't, but it's pretty good. The rot made sense to me, finally. I understood it. While it certainly puts too much burden on the person to the exclusion of whatever the world does with us, but as a young man who grew up in a nice middle-class household with loving parents and good friends, who was too young and white to be affected too much by Vietnam or Jim Crow, the burden had to be on me. Later, I read Augustine's Confessions, which remains one of my favorite books and one of the cornerstones of all Christian thought. And although Augustine didn't use the term, the doctrine of original sin is his. And without that doctrine, I wouldn't be Christian. There wouldn't be really very much in it for me. A year later, I was baptized. I want to take the scenic route here. To be baptized was my free decision, as we usually understand that term. And yet, it was 1981 when the winds seemed to carry religion to a good many people my age. And however much I think God's decision, that my baptism was God's decision and then maybe mine, it was also part of the cultural landscape. There was freedom and there was faith. Of all those who converted to or returned to religion in that time that I came to know, I was in the main demographic for one reason. I was very pale, but I was out of the demographic for two other reasons. First, I didn't take a political hard right turn, as many people who converted in that time did. The tenets of the so-called moral majority and its progeny are actually even maybe more distasteful to me now than they were then, largely because many of its leaders absolutely believed that they were morally superior to the bulk of humanity, and their objective was to separate from, or even worse, to dominate those they thought were inferior to them. They didn't, in other words, really believe in anything like original sin or its counterpart, which I'll talk about in a minute, justification by grace alone. And that is, in my opinion, the detriment of everyone who is not part of their group, which is to say 98, 99% of humanity. Second, and related, I didn't become Christian out of opposition or because I was overwhelmingly angry about people's different moral habits, or because I thought the world was spinning toward annihilation because of, permissiveness, drugs, gay people, hip-hop music, add your own threat to civilization to the list. I came to Christianity to add rather than subtract, to have a gap filled as best God could, to let the light in. I couldn't do it another way because I was the problem. I was inevitably and always a sinner no matter what, and that's what original sin means. Augustine wrote, "Where could I go to escape myself?" His answer was, "So I went to Carthage." You can convince yourself that you've escaped by going to Carthage, Paris, New York, Cody, a career in investment banking, law, theology, social work, family, church, whatever. For Augustine, you will fail even if you don't know it. Because unless you are changed, you'll still be the same you as yesterday. The main job was me, not complaining about how other people live their lives. That way of looking at it is, I also think, partly Wyoming-based, or largely Wyoming-based. It isn't just that the vastness of the landscape and the sparseness of the population are, shall we say, conducive to contemplating exactly who and what you really are. Although for me, it was largely the fate of being born here. One of the reasons my family felt at home in Wyoming is because they were comfortable with what seemed to me to be the dominant ethos of the time, which I'll call old-fashioned libertarianism, which I want to distinguish from new-fashioned libertarianism. I get to do what I want, so long as I don't impose excessive costs on you. And if you don't like it, tough. The price I pay for that is you get to do what you want equally, and if I don't like it, that's tough. I know that's not why Wyoming is the equality state, but this kind of libertarianism and equality seem to me to be two sides of the same coin. But I had a problem without a solution, or at least no solution I could articulate, which occasionally comes in handy. I was pretty good on sin and original sin, but not so hot on what I could do about it. The answer was ultimately nothing. Penultimately, quite a lot. But only if I first accepted that ultimately I could do nothing. Like an animal on a trap, each move makes the trap tighter. Now, this isn't an American solution where activity and doing are such high demands, and for some things they work, like getting a better job, for example. But not for this. Because what the struggle and what the achievement do really is increase the chance that you lie to yourself about who and what you are, and both drive your corruption deeper and project it outward. And then I found the great 16th century reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. Their argument with the Roman Church wasn't about the problem. I know it sounds quaint to say now, but everybody thought the problem was sin and behind that original sin. The difference was whether you could do anything at all to solve the problem. And their answer was, you couldn't. You were made just, your life became worthwhile, in Luther's formulation, by grace alone. And the more you tried to have a role in your own salvation and value, the worse the world and you got. Now I can see Wally, he's being calm, but inwardly he is tearing his hair out right now. And he can commiserate with Suzanne, who's petting his dog, who, whenever she wants to present me as a little bit addled, points to this and my tepidly positive evaluation of the Beatles. But I stand by both. In the great debate between Luther and Erasmus, which some of you may know, Erasmus could remain Catholic because he thought the problem was that the church had failed to reach the moral ideals it had set for itself. Luther, the former monk, thought that the doctrine was corrupt and inevitably led to the moral failures of the church. The Reformation wasn't about morals, it was about doctrines that lead to morals. Thus, Luther was excommunicated, and Erasmus was not. Why does this matter? Well, when I taught theology, I occasionally offered to my students that anybody with 5 minutes and an ounce of imagination could come up with any crackpot scheme of salvation that they wanted to, and many have, from Guyana to the Arizona desert to the Idaho mountains. But what was at stake between Luther and Calvin on the one hand and the Roman Church and the radical Reformation on the other hand wasn't speculation about angels on the head of pins. It was about how the world, this world, could be made better. Because the picture of salvation, whatever it is, mirrors itself back to us on earth. What Luther and Calvin saw was, as long as I had anything to do with my salvation, I'd muck it up. And I would be less for it. Why? Because ultimately whatever I do is going to be largely for me, because I can't get that out of my head, and only incidentally for God and God's creation. So if you have any role in your own salvation, well, ultimately you'll try to. You can't act for others in the end because you have too much to gain, and more important, you can't even really see your neighbor because you're always in the way. What Luther and Calvin believed, and I think they were basically right, is that the doctrine of justification by grace alone makes the moral act and seeing the neighbor truly possible for the first time. We won't ever quite get there, remember original sin, but we can do better than we do, and that's the task. How does that work? Well, for them, first, if rot is part, well, this is more me, if rot is part of who you are, then might you be more sympathetic to others' failings even when they are not your own? Second, they thought that just because you have nothing to do with your salvation and what you do has no effect on your salvation at all, you are finally freed from trying to secure your worth in God's eyes. It won't matter. And that lets you quit interfering with your own best intentions and even change those intentions. With the gift of faith, you're able to act more and more in gratitude for the gifts that God has given and for all that God has placed in your path. Period. You ain't getting nothing for it. So now, if you really believe, you can do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. And in some measure, you more want to. God has given you grace and lots of gifts, so don't insult God by being a cluck. It's not going to cost you eternal hellfire, but come on, don't be a cluck. It's no accident that atheism first arose on Protestant soil a few centuries later, because there's a brilliant insight, sorry Wally, in Luther's Bondage of the Will, to the effect that in the perfect world, what we would really do is forget about God, because we would know of our salvation, and then we could finally pay attention to bettering ourselves and promoting and nurturing the gifts of God around us. Some of the finest people I know, including my Freudian father, aren't religious in the usual sense. They serve God not by worrying so much about God, but by worrying about their part of creation. And God, I hope, is not so needy as to need explicit worship. Still, it's kind of hard to get rid of religious devotion, so instead of God, you often get, nation, racial supremacy, again, add to the list. And then an infinite insult, God gets enlisted to serve those gods. We decide what we want, we throw it up to heaven, and we call it God's will on the return trip. So I think it's generally better to acknowledge God so that it's a little harder for those fake and ultimately corrupt ultimates to sneak in. And as a nation, I'm not sure we're doing particularly well on that score right now. Anyway, that all made sense to me in my teaching career, and it still does. Partly for market reasons, partly because I was tired of moving around and felt a little rootless, and partly because I'd written a couple of books on theories of power and thought I might try out their conclusions. I pivoted to law school and the law. So again, it was addition, not subtraction. Supplement rather than opposition, traveling through the crack to let the light in. Where I've been informed a lot of the counsel I give as a lawyer. I'm a deal lawyer, and my clients and I try to be, reasonably fair and find a deal that may not give everybody everything they want, but makes everybody a little better off, and my clients a lot better off, than they were before it all started. Other opportunities also presented themselves in the transition to law. A close friend, recently deceased, who I'd known since high school, was a pre-law advisor in Utah, and asked me to do a week-long law school preparation course every summer, which we did for 17 years together. When I met Suzanne, she came west with me, and after that week was over, we would travel to Laramie, where my mom still was. Suzanne was smitten with Wyoming, as any reasonable person would be, and that laid the foundation for, years later, why and how we came here. In the Great Recession, which looks minor compared to where 40 million Americans are now, I opened another business to assist prospective law students to get into better law schools and to make it more affordable for them. But I anticipated none of that when I decided to change careers. The change, however, did force me to confront something else. What I had thought my vocational calling was, professional theology, well, it wasn't. I'd slid through another crack onto another road, the destination of which I wasn't then sure of, And I'm still not sure. A few years back, I asked a friend who's a little bit younger, but is still in my generational cohort, how many times in his adult life he'd been right about where he would be 5 years hence. He said, never. If I arrange the calendar properly and carefully, since I've been 26 years old, I can say once. But that's it. That's partly, I think, generational. I'm in the generation that expected the vocational stability that a lot of people in my parents' generation had, and we mostly didn't get it. The generations behind me, I think, expect to have plans A, B, and C, but they also expect to end up with options D, E, and F. It isn't bad necessarily. It can increase inventiveness and flexibility, but it is unsettling. And it makes it harder to have a specific idea of what your worldly value and mission are. And if you need that idea, if that's where your ultimate value is, well, then you have a problem. And I think a lot of Americans in particular are having trouble adjusting to a world that is increasingly without firm footing. It turned out, and there's no wood to knock on here, so I can't. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the vote of confidence. It turned out that I didn't need that. I think because I trust that life is meaningful and that God is creating meaning for me, even if in any moment or even in most moments, I don't really know what it is. 5 years ago, we had no idea that we would reverse my mom and dad's journey we'd repeat actually my mom and dad's journey from New York City to Wyoming, and that we would be permanent residents of Clark. It just seemed to fall that way. So again, kind of choice and destiny. But what it means, I don't know. I can guess, but I don't know. For today, I think that my penultimate, not ultimate, but penultimate comfort is in, by and large, acting with decency and honor and taking care of clients, family, friends, animals, and land that have been entrusted to me as well as I can. Tomorrow, I don't know how I'm going to think about what the years mean, but I trust that whatever I don't know, God only knows. My dad, whose hat I brought, was right when he told his 16-year-old son that I would never know as much as I did right then. Two aphorisms to close. The first from 19th century theologian, Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard, who said that life is lived forward but can only be understood backward. It's a good description of providence. What happens has meaning in retrospect, and if you're a Christian, you might call it providence. It's also a good description of a reflection on a purposeful life, because it assumes that you can understand your life in a meaningful and relatively coherent way. I think that's why Kierkegaard and the existentialists generally were more popular with the generation before me than they were with mine. Because I can't find overarching meaning to where I've been, what I've done, and who I am. Retrospective understanding won't get me actually all that far. But because I believe that God, and God only, knows where I fit in the scheme of things and knows what value I have, I'm actually okay with that. That sense of trust is the second aphorism, which is actually a lyric, because you knew I'd come back to music. The young musician Rhiannon Giddens sings, "I don't know where I'm going, but I know what to do." For the Kierkegaardian, intentional, purposeful life, that doesn't really make any sense. You decide what to do precisely or largely because you have a certain objective in mind. But I think what she captures is where a lot of people born after 1970 and some of us born before actually are. We don't know what it's all for. We don't know what we're for. What we can do is act our best along the way and take care of the things that have been entrusted to us and be stewards of our own little corner of creation. Not because I'm going to get saved because of it, but almost exactly because I'm not. If we actually did it, I think we can hope that in the corner of God's love, that's enough. So, and it didn't rain.
And it hasn't rained yet, so bravo. I'm hoping that well, I'll be able to. Seems very dark here.
Tap on it, it might turn off. Can it turn off?
No, I don't know what.
Figuring that out. So I got this hat out of my closet today. It was my dad's hat, and it turns out that, and it was his favorite hat. It turns out it has this little elder hood thing which he never wore. But he was a thrifty fellow.
Okay, we're back, and if there are any questions out there in question land.
What's the definition of a divine?
I have no idea. I had nothing to do with that, but I wasn't.
That's Wowie's deal?
It was somebody's deal, and I just decided I was never going to change it because there was no other venue in which I was ever going to be called divine. Well, she can call me divine anytime she wants, whether she's got a reason or not. So, I went to the University of Chicago Divinity School, which. Oh, sorry. Feel like what was it? The Sundance Kid. I'm better when I move or something. Yeah, I mean, I had no intention, even 4 months before I did it, of going to divinity school, much less at the University of Chicago. But I applied, they let me in. You know, my work was in the history of Christian thought, but with always kind of a contemporary bent, which were two quite different